in Daniel this morning. So last week we started our lesson on Daniel and trusting in the furnace. We got through a point. We started on point 1, the threat of the world, and I think the king constructs his image was that first sub point. We started that, but I think it's about as far as we got. So we'll pick up right there where we were talking about how Nebuchadnezzar had gone and made war on Judah, and the Lord had delivered him into his hand, and he brought back the choicest of the people to retrain. And we talked about how that was part of the approach at the time, was to take slaves and take captives, especially those who were the brightest and the best, and kind of incorporate them into your government structure to help keep those people in line that you brought back with you. And especially as we saw, the Bible talked about the princes and the leaders, and so he had taken Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and brought them back. And we talked last week about how they had initially refused to eat the king's meat, and how it was sacrificed to idols. They didn't want to defile themselves in their beliefs. And we started talking about how the Lord had given Daniel the ability to interpret dreams, and Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the golden head, and being the humble man that he was, decided to build an entire 90-foot statue for that head so it could look just like him. And that's where we stop. So we're there in that first subpoint of point 1, and is talking about Nebuchadnezzar and building his statue, and how he had brought the entire world, at least the world around him, right? All the heads of state from around him, and he brought them to worship. So our second subpoint there is the king calls all nations to worship. Okay, and in Daniel 3, verse 4, he talks about, then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. So it wasn't a request, a kind, if you would please follow this directive, or hey, if you kind of feel up to it, it's a command from a king to do this. And we see, obviously, we know the story, so we know that they refused. But many times I think we get caught up in the story that we've known. If you've been in church your whole life, you've known since you were little, and you know the end, right? So you're like, oh yes, they refused and the Lord delivered them, and he did. But you need to stop and consider that, and we'll see here shortly, it's made clear to us that they weren't sure that was going to happen, right? I mean, they plainly state when they talk to the king later, he'll deliver us, and if he doesn't, we're still not going to worry about it. And again, I mentioned it before, many times, especially in our country, we've been blessed with the ability to come and do this right here, right? We can jump in our car Sunday morning, nice and dressed up, bring our Bibles, show up, and then afterwards we all run out and grab some Mexican and some Japanese or some Chinese or whatever it is we feel like for lunch, and it's a pretty nice day. We're not sneaking into each other's houses to go in the basement. And so we kind of, I think, trivialize these kind of things in our heads of, the Lord delivers those, and he does sometimes, right? The Bible's full of stories of people he delivered. But I think if you look at these stories, and this one in particular, I don't think he delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because he felt so strongly about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel that he needed to. I think he delivered them because he had a message for King Nebuchadnezzar. Right? They were happened to be the instruments of his message to the king, and a pretty powerful message it is, right? But he made, doesn't mean it had to go that way. And so, we can't get on our horse about, well, the Lord will deliver me. Maybe not. You can't say that. How many of the apostles were martyred? They weren't delivered miraculously by the Lord because they followed him. Doesn't happen regularly, right? So we have to kind of reset our mind about this when we think of these stories and lessons, that we have bias in our mind because we know the Lord delivered them. So we feel like they were really faithful when they were, but they knew he would. Well, I don't think they did. I think they really hoped he would. I don't think they were looking forward to being burned alive in a furnace so hot that it was killing people walking near it. But I think they were ready, right? So he makes this order that everybody should bow and worship. And it's interesting that the signal he uses to do so is some music. Music is a thing that it's very important, and I think we do a fine job here at Currituck. I think music is a thing that gets you ready to worship. I think that having congregational singing is important to prepare yourself to worship. We see Nebuchadnezzar using his music to prepare people to worship to his idol. And we know from looking at other times, if we remember a certain time where the children of Israel when Moses was up toiling on the mountain, they made themselves a golden calf to worship. And if you remember, Moses hears something and he thinks that they're fighting a war down there, but what were they doing? They were playing music as part of their worship to their golden idol. Music that apparently sounded like thousands of men killing each other. So throughout the Bible, we can see music plays a role, and I think most Christians would agree that it does today still. And I think we're blessed to have a church that allows us, because there are many churches today that have kind of fallen into this role of, we have a bunch of people up here to sing to you to make you feel good about yourself and allow you to sit there and receive things. But the congregational singing isn't just, it's not there just to fill time. It's not there just because we've been doing it for 150 years or whatever, and that's what we do. No, it's there so you can sing and worship the Lord and prepare yourself for what the message that's about to come. That's the point of all of this. Whether it's the special singing, the choir singing, which is wonderful, but particularly for you, it's going to be the congregational. It's not there for you to stare at the words on the screen and mumble and think about what you got to do this week. It's there for you to read the words, sing along, prepare your mind, and worship the Lord. That's why we believe so strongly in hymns that are about him, right? Hymns that tell us about him, that laud him, right? And not laud ourselves, and not how all the things the Lord did for me. It's about him, right? Which is why we have to be careful about what we assign to worship the Lord, what we assign to fill our heads with every day, is because it's not all the same. And I'm not going to try to tell you what to listen to every day, but I'll tell you that the devil was the man in charge of the music before he fell. So he's pretty good at coming up with some music. Okay. So, I think the Lord is a wise enough person to have written a Bible that covers everything from Daniel's time to our time. And, what surrounds us is vastly different than what surrounded him, but we have to be wise enough to discern what's worldly and what's not. And that's where we get in trouble, because we want there to be a list of things that I can do and not do and not worry about it. And that's just not how it works. And the only way for us to discern this is for us to be in tune with the Lord and worshiping the Lord and talking to him daily. Because if we're not asking him, if we're not going to him daily, it's the relationship's not going to be there, where he's not going to be able to whisper in your ear and say, is this really what you should be doing today? Because that's how you're going to know what's wrong and what's right. Okay. There's not a list. Pastor can't come up with a list of things to put in the church constitution that tells you what to do and not to do. It just doesn't exist. I mean, come on. Like, the world today is vastly, I mean, I'm only 48, right? I'm not that old. There's a couple people in here older than me. Right? But from the time I was 18, much less born, this world's a vastly different place. And I'm not talking about, what's allowed and what's not allowed and what's legal and what's not legal, right? I'm just saying the world in general, the technology that exists, the access to things that exist, all of the things, they're vastly different, right? And when I was a young man, there was no way for me to know what somebody in Alabama was doing unless I went to Alabama, right? No way from rural northern Michigan that I would ever know anything beyond maybe a county or two, as it goes, unless I was, and again, we didn't have a TV with news on every day, so there's no shot that was happening, right? Listen to a little bit of Paul Harvey every day, maybe a little, NPR. My mama listened to her classical music, right? But I didn't know, and now it's hard for you not to know. It's hard for you not to know. So just you taking that kind of access, that kind of information, that kind of influence that happens, and I won't put any tinfoil hats on today or talk anything about those, but just those kind of things alone, it's a vastly different world, and we have to be careful because it's that much easier to get fooled. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. All right, the next one is the king commands all to bow. So the king didn't ask these folks, he commanded them. And I don't know if you realize this, but a command from a king generally comes with the backing of a sword to your neck, right? Kind of thing. It's not an option. It's not a suggestion. Kings generally don't like it when people don't do what they say. And death is usually on the line. So we could say that it's bow or burn for these gentlemen. And in a very literal fashion. And again, there's nothing literal today for us in this world, necessarily in the United States, but there is in other countries. And we talked about it last time I taught, the Christians that live across this world, there's thousands killed every year because they don't change their belief system, right? We're blessed to not have that problem, but it does exist today. And to some extent, right, I think the greatest threat to us is our, fear of being canceled, which at the end of the day, right, you say, well, I'd rather, being canceled versus being killed, that's the difference. Well, it is, but I'll tell you this, if you bow to the canceled, you might as well be dead. As far as at least your spiritual life, right? If you can't stand to say, no, I believe this, I'm not going to change my thinking just because the world says so, and I'm not afraid of what happens. Like if you bow to what the world says and just to get along and to not cause waves, right? You've pretty much killed your spiritual life at that point. Okay. It is a death, just not your physical death, but you're no longer an effective witness for the Lord, and it's over, right? And so the threat of the cancel, threat of and that doesn't mean it can't get worse, because there are people today that, not necessarily here, but you go to Europe and try to practice Christianity in public, you could end up in jail. You try to practice Christianity in social media, you can end up in jail. All right, so it's coming. And what's it going to be like then? Right now it's easy because we can kind of maintain quietness at all, but once it shows up to are you willing to go to jail, or are you willing to stand for what's right? It starts to become a little more real, and we'll have to see. I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens then. All right, point number 2 is the accusation of the enemy. The accusation of the enemies. Those who stand for God in a hostile culture will soon face accusations from those who despise them. We see the Chaldeans' accusations here in verse 8 and 12 of chapter 3. And the Chaldeans were, they had their own religion. They didn't worship God. They had astrologists, and they worshipped astrology and the signs, and read the planets. And they didn't really care for people who believed in an almighty God and refused to bow to the king. And so, they worked hard to bring to light the fact that they were not doing it. And in verse 12 it says, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Right? So he pointing out that it's the Jews, it's those who you brought back here. They're here causing a problem. But an interesting point that goes along is there's only a few of them right now, right? We just had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know Daniel didn't, right? So there's 3 that didn't. So I'm to assume there's only 3 that didn't, which also implies that all those others that they brought did. So I'll just you can infer the realities of that, right? It wasn't just 4 captives that came out of Judah. There was more, and we don't know about them, but we can infer from that verse here where it says that these few, meaning the majority of them, did. The majority of them followed the plan. The majority of them bowed to the idol. The majority of them didn't cause waves. So where are you at in that group, right? If this auditorium is the group that's brought from Judah and placed in the world as it is, how many of us are going along to get along so we don't cause any waves, and how many of us are refusing to bow to the idol? Arthur Brooks says, fear leads to conformity, which leads to compromise, and that leads to cowardice when it's time to take a stand for the truth. There have been plenty of studies to show that no matter if you know the truth or not, once you get in a group of people who are all doing the same thing, you tend to go along with the group, right? And we have an example here of a study. It says groups of 10 were shown charts with lines of different lengths and asked to identify the longest line. Unbeknownst to one participant, all other 9 in that group were instructed to intentionally choose the second longest line. So despite clear evidence, the unknowing participant conformed to the group's wrong answer 75% of the time. So, well, that's a great psychology lesson. It is. It's a great psychology lesson. But when you factor in that this group here is the 1 out of the 9, you can infer that 75% of us at least would choose the second longest line because everybody else did. And each of us can say privately, no, it wouldn't be me, but at the end of the day, 75% of us are wrong. So these things have to be done with intention. We talked about this last week, right? You're not going to do the right. You're not going to be part of the 25% who choose the longest line if you don't make a point every day to follow the Lord and to choose purposely the path that He wants you on. Okay? Like you can't just wake up every day and just live your life year after year, and then one day all of a sudden be asked to choose which is the longest line and just naturally choose the longest line in the face of everybody around you. Now what you do is you'll choose the second longest line because that's what everybody else did, because you've conditioned yourself to just go along. Okay? Which again highlights, even if there's not things happening today in your life, things that you need to battle, we have to live daily, right? Apostle Paul talks about it, dying daily. We have to live daily and make sure that our flesh stays in line with what the Lord wants. Because if not, we'll end up being part of the group that just gets along to go along. Okay? All right. So we see in verse 12, the bottom of verse 12 there, these men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So we see that the religious leaders there, the Chaldeans, are, identifying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's disobedience here. And as a result, we see that the king gets angry. Our next point is the king's anger, which again I think is something you should expect as a Christian. If you're following what the Lord says, you're going to make some people angry, especially in today's world. So, don't get surprised about that, and don't get your feelings hurt about that. Okay. Many times our problem is we want everybody to like us, and if they don't like us, it bothers us, and we want to make them like us. And in theory, that's not a wrong thing. That I don't want you to have the attitude to go around to make it my goal every day to upset 99% of the people I come across, right? But at the same time, if you're standing for what's right, you can't be bothered by those who get mad about it. Okay. And part of that group will be in this building, by the way. Nebuchadnezzar found out that the Hebrews refused to worship his image. His anger raged. And in verse 13 it says, then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In his rage and fury. That's probably not, you don't want to have the king being in a rage and a fury when you go see him. So in verse 14 he asks, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? All right, and he gives them another chance in verse 15. Now, if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye should be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Again, showing his humility there. So even though he's very angry, he musters up enough diplomacy to give them a second chance. They're like, hey guys, listen, these fellas tell me you're not bowing down and worshiping, but maybe it's just a misunderstanding. So just in case, I'm going to have the fellas play again. You just fall down, worship. It's cool. We're not. But now, I don't know who your God is, but I don't think he's bigger than me, is what he said. Which, he was wrong. All right. But the question is there, right? So we see their example. They had that second chance. What are we going to do when we get pushed kind of with something? Again, they made the stand, right? They were part of that 25% that made the right choice, but then they were put before the authorities and given the option again to save themselves. And thankfully they chose correctly. But I think, again, it just goes to show you that first stand that you make as a Christian may not be the one that ultimately decides where you end up, okay? Just because you made the right choice the first time, you may get a lot more pressure and a lot more put on you to see where that really is, okay? So we have to continue to make the right choice to continue to have the right options at the end. All right, and then the last point is the protection of the Lord. So as we know how the story unfolds, we see the Lord was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego during this trial. And again, we know that he does deliver them. And again, I don't know whether he delivered them for the sake of delivering them or whether he delivered them as part of his ultimate plan with Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar doesn't disappear after this, right? But if they hadn't stood, we probably wouldn't know, right? because we wouldn't know who they were. If they hadn't made the right choice, their names would not be here, just like the majority of those that were brought in captivity. We don't know who the rest of those people brought from Judah were because they followed the plan and didn't stand, right? So we know that without their stand, we wouldn't know who they are. The Lord wouldn't have delivered them. But because of their stand, the Lord delivers them and shows his strength and ability to stand with you in your time of need. So even though they faced the gruesome death of being burned alive, they had a peace-filled confidence in God that allowed them to make the right choice. And I think that when you read their responses, they seems to be very calm and pointed and not worried kind of response, which begs the question of how do we live our life? Do we live our life in the peace of the Lord, or are we living out on the fringe for ourselves? Because I think without the Lord giving you his peace and you following him, you're going to have a hard time making these right choices, because the anxiety of your flesh will drive you to a different answer. So if you don't feel the peace of the Lord in your daily decisions, I would ask you to spend some time with the Lord to get yourself there. Because if you don't feel the peace, I just strongly believe you're not going to make the choice when the time comes. Okay? You have to be able to live, and you're not going to have these kind of choices hit your life every day, Lord willing. At least I don't. And I don't believe you probably do either, although it may come from time to time. But there are plenty of choices that hit you every day, okay? And we should be able to make those choices and be comfortable and have the peace of the Lord and know that we're doing the right thing when we make them every day. And if we don't feel that, if we're struggling with easy choices, you're not going to do well with the big choices, okay? And we know from John 14:27 that he offers, it says here, that peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. So he'll provide you that peace and that strength that you need when you need it, okay? But you have to live with him daily. It's not something that you can just jump into one day when you think you need it really bad, okay? That peace and that strength comes from a daily walk. So given their roles working in the government there, because we talked about last week, right, they were given positions of authority. These were people that came out of Judah. They were educated. They had all of the right things in their life. And they were brought to Babylon, and they were given positions of power after they went through their, kind of re-education. And in that role, they would have known for quite some time what was coming. I don't think that this was kind of a surprise to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think obviously it probably takes a day or two to build a 90-foot statue. And I'm sure they knew the kind of man the king was this entire time. These were bright, intelligent young men. And so none of this is a surprise to them, right? They know he's a very selfish and narcissistic king who very much worships himself. They knew he was building this altar. They knew what the dream was, I'm sure, because Daniel had interpreted, right? Like all these things they knew. They didn't just wake up and see what was coming. But I don't see anything in here about how they decided to try to run, or they decided to try to flee the country, or they decided to go underground with their worship, right? They continued in their steadfastness and didn't change a thing about themselves and their worship of the Lord. So similarly, when we see trials or difficulty looming before us, rather than worrying in fear, we should take these things to the Lord in prayer, thank him for his promises, and trust in him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made these choices not because they had to decide in the minute what they were going to do. They made this choice because for days and weeks and months, they had made that choice every day. And there's nothing different about that day, other than that there was a tiny furnace fire going on that they may get thrown into, right? They were simply just making the same choice they made every day. And because of that, the Lord had strengthened their hearts and calmed them, gave them peace to provide these answers. And in verse 17 of chapter 3, it says, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king." Right? So they calmly say, hey, he's able to do this, right? You notice it says, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, right? They didn't say he was going to. But if he did, he will deliver him out of his hand, right? Because again, remember the king had just made the statement that, I don't know that your God can save you from me because I'm a very important dude, right? But they say, he could. But then in 18, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So, just to let you know, king, our God could, he's able to deliver us out of this. He can do whatever he wants. And he can deliver us out of thy hand. But if he chooses not to, that's his choice, but we're still not going to do what you want. All right? So, again, not something they had to decide. I don't believe that there was any question in their mind. They didn't even hesitate. But again, I think they had been making these choices day after day, living in an environment, right? It wasn't like this was the first day that was adversarial in their life. Okay? They had made choices since they had been taken captive to do this and to follow the Lord. God is able to deliver us from anything he wants us to, but doesn't mean that he will. One of the earliest Christian martyrs was a first-century pastor from Smyrna named Polycarp. He was burned at the stake in his 90s for his faith of Christ, but remained faithful unto his death. And from the first martyr, Stephen, in Acts 7, all the way to the present, untold numbers of believers have died for their faith, but through it all they have chosen to stand for him. You and I can also continue with confidence in our faith. All right, so lastly, I think it is God provides salvation. The God who provided salvation from sin and death through Christ also provides rescue for his people in their hour of need. Always, this rescue is not always salvation from circumstances, but it's always a real rescue from what our life would be without our faith. God did not prevent Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from being cast in the fire. So, again, put yourself in their mindset, right? They don't know whether he's going to deliver them. They know he can if he wants to, but he may not. And as they're getting taken to the furnace, there's nothing coming. There's no lightning out of the sky. There's no horde of angels riding out of the clouds, right? There's nothing's happening. And then they get thrown in the furnace. Probably plenty of time to rethink their choices between making their stand with the king and getting tossed in the furnace. But they don't. And instead of choosing to keep them out of the furnace, the Lord simply chose to be with them in the furnace and to protect them from the fire. So again, we have a mindset that as long as I'm doing what the Lord wants me to do, I'm good. And he'll protect me from bad things happening in my life. No, he won't. He'll be with you. And he may choose to deliver you, but you still may have to go through the fire. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar sees the fourth man, and we know that he says he is like unto the Son of God. And because of that faith, the king was pointed to Christ and made a change. So, again, I don't see anything later on about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego complaining about having to get thrown in the fiery furnace, complaining about their unfortunate circumstances. But the Lord simply used their circumstances and their faith to bring a king to him, right? And many times that's what our trials and troubles are about, bringing people to him. Okay. And you never know who's going to see, you never know one day down the road who your story will touch. But in order to have the story that will touch someone, that will change a life, we have to live every day purposefully and in the peace of the Lord in our choices, so that we know we can live through the furnace and the fire. Again, don't be worried about your comfort of life. Don't be worried about the job you have, right? If you're making the right choices and living the way the Lord wants you to, He'll provide for you. Doesn't mean you're going to have the same job. Doesn't mean you're going to have the same income level. Doesn't mean you're going to have the same quality of life, right? The Bible never says that that's going to happen. But He'll take care of you. If you're living for Him, you're following Him, He'll take care of you. He'll provide your needs. He's promised that many times in the Bible, that He'll provide everything you need. The difference is what we need and what we want are just vastly different things sometimes. All right, so as we close up today, I just want to encourage you to make your choices daily, so that when the time comes that you have to make the hard choice, it's not really a hard choice. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for this time to study your word. Thank you for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their example and their choices that they made daily, and their choice to follow you even in face of danger. I ask that you guide and direct each of us in our choices. Be with the pastor as he brings your message here next, Father. Help us to pay attention, to listen, to worship you today, Father. In Jesus' name, amen.